rocketing and bombing have gone on today, taking more life and trashing property as the two sides eye one another for what they know comes next, an eventual ceasefire. In Gaza, the Hamas leadership has already said it's ready to stop, and that's understandable. It's shown an ability to hit Israeli cities and demonstrated new weapons, even today boasting about their extended reach.
Today, the Qassam brigades and the Palestinian resistance led the Sword of Jerusalem battle into a new advanced and fast stage as it introduced a new weapon. This means that the entire Zionist entity with all its airports and institutions is now within reach of the resistance missiles.
The question now is what the Israeli Prime Minister wants in the way of military results before halting his country's strikes.
For Israel, ending it soon would be preferable. There is not much for Israel to gain in this besides degrading the capabilities of Hamas. And so it may be that in short order, in just a matter of days, we will see the Israelis trying to stop this. But just those days, of course, could include many casualties on both sides and a lot of devastation, especially in the Gaza Strip.
And while the killing continues, intercommunal tensions are boiling over in ways that alarm many Israelis. Jews and Arabs attacking one another in towns inside the recognised boundaries of Israel. Tensions may have lain dormant for years, but this underlines the need for some fresh diplomacy. If the recent violence on Israeli streets and in occupied East Jerusalem highlights the unfinished nature of past peace-building efforts, it also speaks to the need for outside mediation, if only to contain the current crisis.
Egypt has sent envoys to both the Palestinians and to the Israelis to try to see how this can be de-escalated. But I think the problem is not limited to de-escalation. I think we should be looking at the roots of why this happened and how to deal with the situation after we are successful in de-escalating.
It's not that America has completely ignored peacemaking in recent years. President Trump attempted his deal of the century, but it was stillborn, and the Palestinians never regarded him as an honest broker. So what chance a new peace process?
What we have definitely seen from the outset of this administration, I think, is an affirmative choice to not prioritize this issue. And they've learned what so many administrations, though, have before. There's some middle ground, perhaps, between not jumping in first day with a special envoy and trying to get the parties to the table and not doing anything. And try as you might to ignore this conflict, it forces its way back on the agenda.
From the Palestinian and wider Arab side, there's a yearning that issues like the status of Jerusalem, so important in this current round of violence, become part again of an international negotiation. But Israel has only rarely been willing to even countenance that discussion, and its current government, after 4 elections in quick succession, is in crisis.
That Israel is unable to form a government for the last 2 years or so, and they have conducted 4 elections, and probably the 5th may be on the doorstep. So this is also contributing, or I think one of the main elements in relation to what is happening, because there are all kinds of efforts by those in the extreme right to prevent the establishment of an Israeli government.
Tonight, clashes in the Israeli town of Baqa al-Gharbiyah. The country's president has told its people they're risking civil war. The need for de-escalation is urgent, but it could still be days away.
Joining me now are Zaha Hassan, member of the Palestinian delegation to the 2011 and 2012 exploratory Israel-Palestinian peace talks, Danny Ayalon, Israel's deputy foreign minister from 2009 to 2012 and the country's former ambassador to the US, and Martin Indyk, Barack Obama's special envoy for Middle East peace from 2013 to 2014. Welcome to you all. Martin, if I could begin with you, what do you make of Joe Biden's management of this conflict to date?
Well, it was not a priority for him. He had a whole set of other priorities. just to run through them, it's obvious why. Pandemic, the economic recovery, climate change, the rise of China, Iran's nuclear weapons program. And he was with me in the last round of final status negotiations when he was vice president. I was Obama's envoy. And he saw there the reality that the two sides were further apart at the end of the negotiations than at the beginning. And I think he sized up both Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, and I think correctly concluded that there was no peace deal to be had here. And so, therefore, he was going to focus on other priorities. But now, as a result of this unexpected flare-up, he's had to come back and focus on it. But I think his focus will be on trying to get a ceasefire and stabilize the situation. He should try to build a political horizon for the Palestinians, but I don't believe there's going to be any effort to try to get back to the negotiating table for a final peace agreement, because I think that's, in the present conditions, a hopeless challenge.
A hopeless challenge. Zaha, is that the right approach from Joe Biden? This is a big test for him with the Palestinian people to see if he can be what they didn't feel Donald Trump was, an honest broker.
Definitely, the Biden administration wants to be disengaged from Israel-Palestine peacemaking, and it's absolutely correct. There's not much that can be done in terms of getting the parties back to the negotiating table to negotiate what. The situation is, we need to remind ourselves, an occupation between Israel, the occupying power, and the Palestinian people who are occupied. It's an asymmetrical relationship. The Palestinians have very little power over Israel and very little leverage. So that's why international engagement and the engagement of the U.S., who has a very special relationship with Israel and has quite a bit of influence over its ally. That's why it's so imperative to have outside external, involvement here. But yet the Biden administration has, as was said, has other priorities. Yet it's very much implicated in terms of Israel's, security assistance that it provides Israel. It's implicated to the extent that it is engaging in multilateral mechanisms to provide political cover for Israel. It's engaged in terms of seeking out further Arab normalization agreements to legitimate Israel's presence in the Middle East. So, it's choosing what it wants to be engaged in. And now we've reached the point where, putting off dealing with the occupation, dealing with what's now morphed into what human rights organizations are saying is an apartheid situation, has now, bumped up the priority list. And the administration is sort of on a back foot here.
And perhaps that next move will be very closely watched, I'm sure. But building on what you've just said there, let me bring in Danny Ayalon here. From the position of how to get back to some kind of negotiating table, how important do you think America's role is here, or is that not something that is featuring at the moment?
Well, I'm afraid there is a unanimity here in our panel that the United States does not want to be engaged in the Middle East at all, and particularly not with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think Biden has been so experienced, 40 years of watching diplomacy from this vantage point of the Capitol building, and then, of course, the White House, 8 years of Vice President of Obama, and also witnessing at least 4 administrations of 4 different presidents who have tried and failed. And they failed simply because there was no common ground. I would say that, if you look honestly, Israel has put forth very generous plans, great painful concessions, but to no avail. So Biden, understanding that, doesn't want to spend or waste any political capital or prestige. Now, if you look at it strategically, the United States does not have too much interest in the Middle East anymore because of its energetic independence. So they have other bigger fish to fry, whether it's China, relations with Russia, as Ambassador Indik said, climate change, and
so if it's not for America to play this role, which some have argued it should be, and Biden himself, I will bring Martin back in a moment, but Biden himself, America is back, going to be not lying down and getting involved where it needs to. What will it take from your position, Danny, and from your experience to try and bring this to some kind of an end, but also to come to the table?
Well, Emma, simply put, it would take a trustworthy and legitimate Palestinian partner. Right now, there is a disarray. You have a major split between Ramallah, the Palestinian Authority, with Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, and Hamas in Gaza, which are really at loggerheads. The Palestinians did not have elections now for 15 years. And there is no agreement whatsoever on how to approach. We have Hamas, who openly is sworn on the destruction of the state of Israel. We do not see that Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority is very much ready to move forward to, I would say, peaceful negotiations and peaceful relationship without incitement,
and that point I will again put back to Zaha in a moment. But just to say, in terms of this particular conflict, how much longer is Netanyahu going to sanction this violence and keep it going? And how much harder will it be to get back to the table the longer it goes on?
Well, it does not really depend on Netanyahu nor on an American president. It has to be the two sides to agree. I do not blame American diplomacy. I think it's very competent, but the American cannot want or desire peace more than the parties themselves. So the United States can offer some sort of safety net, whether it's political, strategic, economic, but not more than that.
OK, let me go back to Zaha there. The point there being raised is around who would be around the table representing Palestinian civilians, should that table be reached. What is your view of that and your answer as to who would advocate for Palestinians?
Let's step back for a second. I want to challenge this notion that this is an issue of personalities between the Israeli prime minister or the Palestinian president. It's really not about that at all. It's about the fact that we have an Israeli government and an Israeli consensus around the idea that Israel should maintain sovereignty and control over the West Bank and should continue its colonization of the West Bank and continue to displace Palestinians in favor of Jewish settlement. That's why we are here at this moment that we're in, because of what happened in Jerusalem and how very vividly that point was made in terms of the Sheikh Jarrah forced displacement. There you had families that had been displaced from 1948 and were living in this part of East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem, and they were being forced out by the Israeli government in favor of settlers because of this Israeli desire to ensure a Jewish majority a decisive Jewish majority inside Jerusalem and by extension the rest of the West Bank. This is the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter is the continuing Nakba that Palestinians are facing. This is the dispossession of Palestinians from 1948 that saw 3/4 of the Palestinian population removed from their homes. And it's continuing today. It's continuing in places like Jerusalem. And that is where this whole situation began. And that's where it's continuing. And until we address that root cause, there is no negotiating table. Why should Israel come to a negotiating table? They know exactly what they want, and there's nobody to stop them. And that's why having international...
Let me bring in... Sorry, well, I did ask you a slightly different question, but I get the point around the negotiating table. Danny, you're shaking your head there.
Yeah, well, I would take to task what Ms. Hassan said, because Israel has been, as I mentioned, generous. 2,000 Camp David. I was there, I believe Ambassador Indik was there. Ehud Barak, then the Prime Minister, put forward a very, very painful concession from Israel, including the division of Jerusalem. Settlements are not the issues. Also, he was ready to pull out most of the settlements, but at that time, Arafat refused. I think there is a testimony by then President Clinton, who put the blame squarely on Arafat and the Palestinian delegation at the time. And then it was a repeat in 2007, 2008 in Annapolis. Another prime minister, which was Ehud at the time, with Abu Mazen at this time, also made the same offer and even further concessions. And again, Abu Mazen just bolted.
I know we could keep going with how these things had played out along the way, but I'm very keen to go back to Martin here. And it sort of does bring it together in some ways that we're going back over even what the terms are here. Do you have any hope at all of there being a table to get back to, having even heard how we've talked about this evening?
Well, I think it's looking at the wrong issue at this moment. All of those things are important. Each side has their own narrative about who's to blame and what the core issues are. But at the moment, there's a hot conflict going on between Israel and Hamas. Hamas doesn't want to be at the negotiating table. It doesn't believe in a two-state solution. It believes in a one-state solution, which involves the elimination of Israel. And so the question is not how do we get back to the negotiating table and make peace. The question is how do we end the fighting, and how do we do it in a way that opens up a political horizon for the Palestinians, a path that can lead over time through small incremental steps that rebuild confidence and trust of both sides in the intentions of the other, so that eventually we can get to the negotiating table. But that's so far from prospect at the moment that we really need to be focused on things that are more immediate and more realistic.
Thank you very much.